Hola y bienvenidos a este video en el que vamos a hablar sobre los pronombres en español. Hello and welcome to this video in which we're going to talk about Spanish pronouns. I'm going to give you everything you need to know about all the different types of pronouns in Spanish. Los pasos que vamos a seguir son los siguientes. Primero vamos a definir qué son los pronombres y cuál es su propósito en la lengua española. Vamos a aprender sobre los pronombres de sujeto y los pronombres reflexivos y cómo se usan. Y finalmente vamos a aprender sobre los pronombres de objeto directo e indirecto y cómo usarlos. Empecemos. Let's get started. ¿Qué son los pronombres? In short, pronouns are words that can act as a noun or replace a noun in a phrase or a sentence. So in English I might say, I went to the shop with Juan. Here the pronoun I is a subject pronoun. It's telling me who did the going, who did the verb to go. And since I'm going with Juan, if I've already mentioned Juan, I could say I went to the shop with him. So him is replacing Juan. If Juan and I bought a book at the shop, I could say we bought it at the shop if the book has already been referred to. If it's our book, I could say, yeah, it's ours. Ours is replacing our book. If we bought it ourselves, then ourselves is also a pronoun referring back to us to specify that we're the people who did the buying. So these are all different types of pronouns. So those examples I just gave you fit into the following categories of pronouns, which you can find in English, but you'll also find in Spanish and many other languages. First, there's subject pronouns, and they go with verbs. They tell us who is doing the verb. We also have possessive pronouns, which are slightly different but related to possessive adjectives. An adjective describes a noun, so if I say that's my pen, my is describing the noun pen, whereas a pronoun will always replace a noun. So if I say that's mine, the word mine has replaced my pen. There's reflexive pronouns which show that the subject and object are the same. So if you do an action to yourself or someone does an action to themselves, then that is a reflexive pronoun, and these are used a lot more in Spanish than they are in English. And finally, object pronouns, which in English are quite straightforward. Me, you, him, her. Instead of he or she, it's him or her. It, us, and them. So instead of we, it goes to us. Different to subject pronouns. And these are often used with prepositions like to or with. I went to the shop with him. He bought the flowers for her. So we'll now work through those four categories of pronouns in Spanish. Empezando con los pronombres de sujeto, starting with subject pronouns. Now, as mentioned in English, these are I, you, he, she, it, we, you, they. And increasingly people are using the singular they as well. In Spanish, this would be yo, tú, él, ella, ella, nosotros or nosotras or even nosotres, modern, more gender-inclusive language, vosotros, vosotras or vosotres, y ellos, ellas or ellas. Remember, the O is for the masculine, the A is for feminine, and the E is increasingly being used to include non-binary people or just to be more gender-inclusive. Now, in English we use these all the time because if not, it would be really unclear who's doing the verb. Because our verbs often just have two forms, like go and goes or eat and eats, we kind of need to specify who's doing the action. But Spanish is what's called a pro-drop language. That means you can drop the pronoun a lot of the time without it really making the communication unclear. You can still show who's doing the verb just because Spanish has such unique verb endings. For example, if I said yo estudio, I study, well, the yo is telling me I, but the ending on estudiar, estudio, that can only mean I. So actually if I drop yo estudio and I just say estudio, it's still equally clear and I've just saved myself a syllable. Generally languages evolve to be more efficient, and Spanish, because it has these verb endings and it kind of makes it quite clear who's doing it, most of the time people don't use these subject pronouns, but you do have to know them. A time when you do see them used is with the third person singular, because if I just said estudia, it could be he studies, it could be she studies, so it's a lot more common to see él estudia, ella estudia. Another time is if I'm asking someone, ¿qué piensas? What do you think? If I really want to accentuate and emphasize that I'm asking what you think, I could use the pronoun for that as well. ¿Qué piensas tú? Yes, kind of, what do you think, rather than what do you think? Ahora la segunda categoría, los pronombres posesivos. Now for the second category, possessive pronouns. Los pronombres posesivos indican pertenencia o posesión. These pronouns show belonging or possession. Son diferentes a los adjetivos personales. They're different to possessive adjectives. An adjective has to go with a noun, so I'd have to say like my pen, his pen, her pen, whereas the pronouns can replace the noun itself. And these in English are mine, yours, his, hers, ours, yours, and theirs. And in Spanish you've got mío, tuyo, suyo, nuestro, vuestro, suyo. The adjectives are mi, tú, su, so very, very similar. And because nouns can be masculine singular, They can be feminine and singular. They can also be plural. We have the same 4 forms that we see all the time in Spanish. Just like with adjectives, rojo can become roja, rojos, rojas, depending on the noun. In this case, the noun we're replacing will decide whether we're saying eso es mío, es mía, son míos o son mías. Miremos algunos ejemplos. Let's take a look at some examples. La chaqueta es mía, pero esos zapatos son tuyos. The jacket is mine, but those shoes are yours. Instead of saying the jacket is my jacket and those shoes are your shoes, I can use a possessive pronoun to replace the noun, to avoid saying it twice. Él me trajo mi pasaporte, pero dejó el suyo en casa. He brought me my passport, but he left his own, or his one, at home. So here I'm also using an object pronoun, the me, which we'll talk about a bit later, but let's focus here on el suyo, because I've mentioned the word pasaporte. El pasaporte is a masculine noun. Instead of saying trajo mi pasaporte, pero dejó su pasaporte, he left his passport, there's no point saying the word passport twice, so I can just say like he left his. It's more efficient, it sounds a lot more natural, which is why learning how to use pronouns is really essential to sounding more native when we speak Spanish. No sé de quién son esas gafas, no son nuestras. I don't know whose are those glasses, who those glasses belong to. They're not ours, they're not our ones. So again, it avoids me saying no son nuestras gafas. Ahora la tercera categoría, los pronombres reflexivos. Now for the third category, reflexive pronouns. These are words that we use with reflexive verbs, which you might have heard of. You might already know some reflexive verbs in Spanish. They're generally verbs that imply we do something to ourselves, like I hurt myself. The subject pronoun is telling me who's doing the hurting, and the myself bit is telling me that it's being done to me. I could hurt someone else, or someone could hurt me, in which case the subject, the person doing the verb, and the object, the person who the verb's done to, are different people. But if it's done to the same person, then it's reflexive. So in English we talked about what these look like: myself, yourself, ourselves, themselves. In Spanish it's me, te, se, nos, os, se. So I could say me levanto, te levantas, se levanta, nos levantamos, os levantáis, se levantan. When we're writing the infinitive, we tag the se pronoun on the end, so it's all one word. I had a Spanish teacher that called these arse verbs because all the AR verbs, they end up ending in arse. It's one way to remember them. And there are loads of these verbs. The meaning of levantarse is to get oneself up, like in the morning. Cansarse is to kind of tire oneself out. Yo me canso mucho, I tire myself out a lot. Enfadarse, to get angry. So this one in English is not really reflexive. I get myself angry? No. Yo me enfado mucho, I get angry. Sentirse, to feel. In English it's not really reflexive, so they don't always use the same pronouns in English. They don't use any pronouns. If I said I feel bad, me siento mal, in English it's not I feel myself bad. So that's something that can be confusing with these. There's lots more reflexive in Spanish than in English. Some things like ir, to go, have a reflexive equivalent with a different meaning or a slightly different meaning. So ir is to go and irse is to leave, to go away from somewhere. If someone says vete, go away. If I said me voy, it's like, right, I'm off. Different to voy, I'm going. Lavar is to wash. Lavo mi carro, I wash my car. Me lavo, I wash myself. That one kind of makes sense. Dormir, to sleep, also has dormirse, to fall asleep. Duermo 8 horas, I sleep 8 hours. Me duermo muy rápidamente, I fall asleep very quickly. Quedar is to meet up with someone, to set a date to meet up. ¿A qué horas quedamos? What time are we meeting? Whereas quedarse is to stay. Yo me quedo en casa, I'm staying at home. So to see some examples in Spanish, I could say yo me levanto, I get up. This is something from the daily routine, which is a really good introduction to using reflexive verbs. I do have a video on the present tense, daily routine, and also past tense, so if you're not too familiar with reflexive verbs or daily routine, I recommend you check those videos out. But remember, the yo is optional. I can just drop that and say me levanto. Me levanto, I get myself up. The reflexive pronoun should go before the conjugated verb. It is different if it's an infinitive verb. Voy a levantarme, if I'm using an infinitive, I can put it at the end. I kind of tag it onto the end of the infinitive. If I said me gusta levantarme temprano, I like to get up early. Again, because I'm using the infinitive, levantar, I tag it on the end, levantarme. If I were to put it in the past tense in the third person, I could say él se levantó, he got himself up. Again, we've got the subject pronoun and the reflexive pronoun followed by the verb. Y ahora los más difíciles, los pronombres de objeto. Now for the difficult ones. object pronouns. There were a couple of comments on past videos of people asking me specifically to do a video about these pronouns. I wanted to include lots of other pronouns because it's really important to have that foundation. Thank you to those people for motivating me to get this video done. I hope by the end of this video that those two people and loads of other people will be able to use these with a bit more confidence. Object pronouns show the person or the thing receiving the action of a verb or a preposition in a sentence. Okay, let's say that again. Object pronouns show the person or a thing receiving the action. What that means is if the action is speaking, if you're speaking to someone, that someone is the object of the speaking. If you hit someone, the action is hitting, and the person being hit is the object. So a verb can have a subject and an object. The subject tells us who's doing the action of the verb, and the object is who it's being done to. For example, if I said, I watch TV, veo la tele, or yo veo la tele. The action is watching, it's the verb ver. The subject is I, which is yo, or it can just be in the o that I put on the end of ver. And the thing being watched, the object, is the tele, the TV, la tele. So I am the subject because I'm doing the watching. The TV is the object because it's being watched. If I swapped the subject and object, it would mean the TV was watching me, which would be strange. Now I could say I watch it. Someone says, do you watch much TV? I say I watch it from time to time. We do this all the time. That's what pronouns are for. It's efficiency. The TV's been mentioned. I can replace it with the pronoun it. Again, we have the same action, the same subject, and I've replaced the object TV. Because it's la tele, I use the pronoun la. If it was something else, las noticias, I'd say las, yo las veo. If it was el documental, the documentary, it's el, so it's masculine, I'd say yo lo veo. In Spanish, there are direct object and indirect object pronoun. If I were to buy a book and I said, I bought a book, compré un libro. The action is buying, the verb comprar. Again, the subject is I, and the object is the book. Now it's a direct object because I'm buying the book. The book is being bought directly. The verb to buy is affecting the book. It's being bought. If I added on who I bought it for, yo compré un libro para ti. I bought a book for you. Now there's another object. I did something for you, so you're also an object. I'm still the person doing the buying, but I did it for you. But you're an indirect object because the verb, the action is buying. I didn't buy you. You're not the object of the buying itself. In English, instead of saying I bought a book for you, to be more efficient, I might say I bought you a book. The action is still buying. The subject is still I. But now we have it very clearly the direct object and the indirect object. So not all sentences have both. If I buy something, it's just one object. If I buy a coffee, the coffee's been bought. If I buy my mum a coffee, then I've bought coffee, the direct object, for my mum, the indirect object. Now if someone were to ask me, did Juan tell you the story of the day we met? Juan te contó la historia del día que nos conocimos? My response could be quite long. I might say, sí, Juan me contó la historia del día que ustedes se conocieron. It's a very long answer. I could shorten this by saying sí. Él me contó la historia del día que ustedes se conocieron. So yes, he, instead of Juan told me, yes, he told me. So I've replaced Juan with he, the subject pronoun. I could just shorten it a bit further by saying sí, él me contó la historia. Yes, he told me the story. But la historia, why mention la historia? The person's asked me about the story. They've made it clear that the story is the object. It's the thing being told. It's being told by Juan. It's being told to me. Juan is the subject. The story is the thing being told. It's the direct object. I'm the person it's being told to. I'm the indirect object. All those things are already clear in the conversation. So I can just shorten it all the way down to sí. Él me la contó. Yes, he told it to me. He told me about it. Now, let's look at that in a bit more detail. What have I just done here? When I say, sí, él me la contó, I've got the action of telling. I've got the subject, so I've changed Juan to a subject pronoun. Él is the person doing the telling. I've got the direct object, the thing being told, and the indirect object pronoun, which is me. He was telling me the story. Now I thought I'd start off with those examples to show you how they work in a sentence and see them in context before showing you all of the different object pronouns, the direct ones and the indirect ones, because it can be a little bit overwhelming, but at least now we can look at those knowing more or less how they work, how they fit into a sentence. So the English ones would be me, you, him, her, it, us, you, and them. And in English, they're pretty much the same whether you're the direct or the indirect object. So in English, it's very straightforward, but unfortunately for you, I guess, if you're watching this, you already speak English, so you've got the slightly less straightforward Spanish ones to learn, which are me, te, lo or la, which depends on whether the person or the noun we're talking about is masculine or feminine. Nos, os, and los or las, again for the person or the people or the noun, the plural nouns that we're replacing. If they're indirect object pronouns, they're pretty much the same, so that's good news. There's less to learn here. The only ones are the third person singular and third person plural, which go to le and les. Just a quick reminder to hit that like button if you found this video useful, if you found it interesting. If you have any comments, please do use the comment function below. You can say something that you learned, something that you found a bit difficult. If you haven't already done so, please do hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on any of the future videos. You can also turn on notifications. So we've talked about loads of different pronouns. Let's quickly recap. In English, the subject pronouns are I, you, he, she, it, we, you, they. And in Spanish, there's also a you formal and a you formal plural, which is usted and ustedes. The direct object pronouns are me, te, lo, la, nos, os, los, las. And the indirect object pronouns are me, te, le, nos, os, les. So here we have pretty much everything we've talked about so far today. The key thing to take away here is that the reflexive pronouns, the direct object pronouns, the indirect object pronouns, now that we see them all together, we can see that they're pretty much the same for the I form, the you form, the we, and the you plural. The you plural isn't used whatsoever in Latin America, so if you're learning Latino Spanish, you can just forget about you plural, basically, because they use ustedes instead, which is the same as the they plural form. So the ones that we've got to look out for, because this is where people get a bit confused and use the wrong pronoun, are the third person ones. If I'm describing the direct object pronoun, this is going to be lo or la. If it's el something, el bolígrafo, it's going to go to lo when I replace that noun. If it's la revista, it's going to be replaced with la. And the same with los and las, which is very handy because it's the same as the word the. And if I'm talking about the indirect object, it's le or les. There is an exception which really catches people out, but I'm going to show you loads of examples so that this makes sense. Basically, because you often use direct and indirect object pronouns together, for some reason in Spanish you don't say le lo or le la or les los. I guess because it's a lot of la going on, le lo dije. To avoid that kind of double L sound, I suppose is the logic, it goes to se. And I'll show you some examples, but basically if I were to say I told it to him, se lo dije instead of le lo dije. That's kind of what happens. If I were to say yo mando la carta a Alejandra, I send the letter to Alejandra, this sentence has all the things we need to practice. It's got a subject, I, it's got a verb, the verb to send, it's got an action, sending, it's got a direct object, the thing being sent, una carta, a letter, and it's got a person who it's being sent to, an indirect object, Alejandra. Now first I could make this more efficient by replacing the direct object, la carta. If we already know we're talking about una carta, then I can replace that with just la. Yo la mando a Alejandra. So la carta replaced with la. I can also use something called a prepositional pronoun, which is a pronoun that goes after a preposition like to or with or for, and these are the same as the subject pronouns except for me and ti instead of yo and tú. Here what I'm going to do is just replace Alejandra with ella. Yo la mando a ella. I send it to her instead of I send it to Alejandra. Remember as well with la mando, I send it. In English the word it is going after the verb. In Spanish it's got to go before. La mando, it, I send instead of I send it. But by far the most efficient and natural sounding option here, if all the different elements of the sentence are already established, so I don't need to be repeating the letter and Alejandra, then I should replace Alejandra and replace her with the indirect object pronoun, which would normally be le. I'm sending it to her, it should be le, which would be yo le la mando. But remember that exception, I can't say le la or le lo, I have to change le to se. So our final kind of most condensed down option is yo se la mando, or I can get rid of the yo and just say se la mando. Not le la mando, se la mando. If you were to say le la mando, it's not the end of the world. People would still be impressed that you know your object pronouns. Now we've seen those examples in the present tense, we're going to look at how this works in the near future tense, because the word order changes a little bit. If I said, I'm going to send the letter to Alejandra, yo voy a mandar la carta a Alejandra, then I would have to put the direct object pronoun before the voy a part. So the near future tense has a conjugated form of the verb to go, the preposition a, and then an infinitive verb. Voy a mandar. I'm going to put the it, that I'm going to send it, I'm going to put that right at the beginning. It, I'm going to send. La voy a mandar. Okay, so try and remember that it goes before the first conjugated verb. If I now replace Alejandra with se, the indirect object pronoun, that goes first of all. So it goes indirect, then direct, and then your verbs. Se la voy a mandar, or yo se la voy a mandar. Now, to really blow your mind, Spanish has some flexibility with these sorts of sentences, because I can actually take the two direct object pronouns and I can just stick them on the end of an infinitive. You cannot do this with a conjugated verb, with an exception that I'm going to talk about in just a minute, but you can do it with an infinitive. If I wanted to say I like to send it to her, weird sentence, but me gusta mandársela, it also works because I'm using an infinitive. So voy a mandársela. Another really quirky thing is if I want to really emphasize who is the subject, who is doing the sending, I can also put that one at the very end. Se la voy a mandar yo. I'm the one that's going to send it to her. Se la voy a mandar yo. No te la vas a mandar tú. It's not you who's going to send it to her, it's me. I don't know what this letter is, it sounds important, but if you want to really emphasize the person doing the thing, then you can put it at the end. Just like that example of, instead of tú qué piensas, what do you think? ¿Qué piensas tú? What do you think? So often putting the subject pronoun at the end, it's a bit like when we put the subject pronoun in italics in a novel in English. And now for the only other time that you can put those direct and indirect object pronouns at the end of the verb and tag it in so it's all one word, it's when you're using the gerund or the continuous. Estoy mandando la carta a Alejandra. I'm sending, in the continuous form, the gerund form, sending the letter to Alejandra. La estoy mandando a Alejandra. Once again, it goes before my first conjugated verb. La voy a mandar, la estoy mandando. Here I've just dropped the yo. Now that we've used that enough, I've talked about it being a pro-drop language. You don't really need it pretty much all the time. Se la estoy mandando. Okay, once again, it's indirect, then the direct, then your conjugated verbs. And here's that flexibility that I can say se la estoy mandando, or I could also say estoy mandándosela. So when we're using the ando or the yendo equivalent to the ing in English, you can also tag those things on the end. So it's only with the ing equivalent, the gerund or the present continuous, and with infinitives. The rest of the time you've got to put it before and they've got to be separate words. There's not really any difference in meaning. You'll hear these used interchangeably. Sometimes it just sounds better with certain verbs to tag it on the end. Might be personal preference. I don't really consciously use one way or the other. It's just whatever sounds best. Y para terminar, practiquemos. To finish us off, let's do some practice. In a moment, I want you to pause the video and work out how you can change the following sentences, numbers 1 and 2, to make them shorter, to make them more efficient. And then for 3 and 4, I want you to just translate those things into Spanish and see if you can make them as short as possible using those pronouns that we've talked about today. So pause the video, and when you're ready to get the answers, press play. Okay, número 1. Yo leí los libros antes de regalarlos. I read the books before giving them away. I've already used one direct object pronoun. I've put it on the end of regalar, regalarlos. Now for this I could say yo los leí antes de regalarlos. So instead of yo leí los libros, I've just changed los libros to los. Nice and easy. And here the word for the happens to be the same as the direct object pronoun I need to use, so it's a nice simple one. As these are a lot of the time, they're not always difficult. Number 2 is where we get into those difficulties because we've got a direct object and an indirect object. We're telling a joke, but we're telling it to our friend Luis. So I could say, yo lo voy a contar a mi amigo Luis. I could just replace one of those things. I'm going to tell it, or it am going to tell to my friend Luis. So I've still kept it a little bit long. If I want to get rid of my friend Luis and just change it to the indirect object pronoun, I need to remember that I cannot say yo le lo voy a contar. I have to say yo se lo voy a contar. And I've got that flexibility to also say voy a contárselo. I'm going to tell it to him. Número 3. She bought it, referring to the watch, for me. Ella lo compró para mí would be the kind of easier way. Here I've said lo to replace el reloj. She, it, bought, and then for me I've just kept as para mí. I've used that prepositional pronoun that I touched upon. But I can use an indirect object pronoun. Instead of saying for me, I can say like she bought me it. In which case I'd say ella me lo compró. And that's the most efficient way that will make you sound the most natural when you're speaking Spanish. Finalmente, número 4, we threw them, referring to the magazines, las revistas, in the bin, la papelera. Nosotros o nosotras las tiramos en la papelera. Nice and simple. Las revistas, I'm just shortening to las. So hopefully this video has given you a bit more confidence using pronouns. Maybe they've gone from making absolutely no sense to making some sense. It might be you want to re-watch certain parts of the video now that you've done a bit of practice, had a go, seen some context, because we've covered an awful lot in this video. I might try and do some shorter videos that go into depth but just for one type of pronoun, because I appreciate it's a lot to cover. It's a really comprehensive video, but hopefully it will help you to take your Spanish to the next level.